Would like to invite Mr. Sanjay Sharma, Managing Director, Estelas Pharma India Private Limited, to introduce us to our next speaker. Welcome and over to you.
Thank you, Kathy. Hello, everyone. I am very pleased to welcome you to our next session, which is going to be a panel discussion on the topic leveraging data as the future of R&D. And we'll start the session with our introductory presentation by Sanjay Jaiswal. So briefly introduce Sanjay here. So Sanjay is Managing Director at Accenture Applied Intelligence, leading R&D analytics in North America for Accenture's life sciences, healthcare, veterinary medicine, and cross-industry clients. He has very rich experience, and he has worked in AWS, Azure, and Google Cloud platforms. So I would like to invite Sanjay to make his presentation. Over to you, Sanjay. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Sanjay. Thank you so much for the introductions. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be here. So today, as Sanjay said, right, I'll be discussing the impact of data within the broadly, R&D sphere of the entire life science. Right? So if you can go to the next slide. So, if you think about, and I think this is a theme that you guys have seen, right, across the conference, right, data-driven insights is the driver, right, for a lot of growth. And we already saw it in the acceleration of the COVID vaccine at Pfizer and some of our other clients, right, how data drove very quick insights in a process that would normally take years, multiple years, was done in less than a year, right? So there's definitely a great potential to apply some of those learnings back in the broader pharma life sciences R&D, right? So with that, if you go to the next slide, please. So if you look at broadly the industry, right, the biopharma itself, there are three key themes that kind of stand out to us, right, which I think are impacting the broader growth of pipeline, finding the right solutions to a lot of issues we are facing from a patient perspective in several therapeutic areas. Right? One is, as you see, number one, the speed to market, right? As I discussed, right? Normally, any R&D, drug, right, from its initial, molecule discovery or lead optimization all the way to final, approval takes years, right? Sometimes multiple decades even, right? And a lot of it is driven, by the several, the process that we need to go through from a regulatory perspective, the process we need to focus on the right molecule, and then the clinical trial process itself, right, from phase 1 to phase 3B and 4, right? So that's one piece of it. The second piece is what this entails is that entire process. There are several shareholders and stakeholders involved, right? And bulk of it, as you can see, is broadly in the clinical trial execution part of it, but we also have pharmacovigilance, the regulatory side, and of course the early discovery. Right? So a lot of this is today driven, by the traditional ways of driving drug discovery. A lot of it is gut-based, historical-based, and this is where we need to pivot, right? And then, lastly, right, from a regulatory perspective, as we get our drug approvals from FDA or from EMA or even within India and broadly or in Japan, for example, right? Each and every entity has a different set of compliance requirements, right? So you have to literally, get that reapproval of the drug in every geographical region, and each of these regulations are changing constantly as we navigate the COVID crisis, right? And some of the other challenges. So this becomes a very customized, regulatory process by country, and so this also adds to that burden, right? So if you go to the next slide, so if you look broadly, right, for the first issue, as you can see here, right, as the pharma companies are speeding to market, and we talked about this, right, the revenue itself is diminishing. If you look at the data from 2009 to 2019, 2020, as you can see, there has been a diminishing revenue for every dollar spent on R&D. So this literally is crying for some insight that will help optimize and drive this process. And this is where the data-driven R&D will play a big role, right? If you go to the second part, the second slide, please. And in the next slide, right, just kind of going deeper within the R&D spend itself, as you can see, right, the CAGR has been, R&D spend continuously increase as more and more companies move upstream, come out of the commodity pharmacovigilance practice, for example, or outsource it. More and more money is being spent in the discovery clinical trials itself, right? But if you look at it, that spending is increasing, the CAGR of almost 3.2% to almost 223 billion projected in 2026. And if you look at it, right, a bulk of it is in the clinical trial execution business. And as the case study that I pointed out, right, what we learned from the COVID vaccine discovery is we can literally shrink that cycle. And a lot of it is data-driven insights that can help take us to that next step. And we'll look at a few cases where and how we can do this, and actual case studies where this has been done in the industry. If you go to the next slide, the third perspective, right, is the data itself, right? So data by itself, is just latent potential power, right? It has to be curated, it has to be cleaned for it to drive the right insights. And the data itself is not just, the information that you have from historical clinical trials. It's also industry data that is being produced by your competitors. It's available, in terms of insurance claims, for example. It's available from the hospitalization information that's actually available from patient surveys, patient engagement studies. So there's a lot of information available out there, right? But the challenge has been, how do you bring it all together to make it usable, right? Just data by itself is and even some cases bring the right data, right? Because not every data may be useful for the therapeutic area that you're working in, right? So it's finding the right data sets, understanding what they can do, and then bringing them together to drive the right insights to help move your R&D forward, right? So if you look at some of the data here, right, it talks about the number of drug warning letters which have been received by the companies, and given the amount of social media, people, the patients actually sharing their perspectives. Now the adverse events, for example, as we learned through the COVID times, are being posted globally and it's known to everyone. So the companies have to keep a step ahead of all these changing timelines, etc. Right? And as I talked about, there's different types of data that you also have to bring in, and then finally, right, this has to be customized also based on the compliance requirements in each of the areas, right? So GDPR for Europe, for example, the privacy rights, and then the PII, PHI requirements. All of that has to be factored into this data. Who can see it, not see it, to help you drive the right insights, right? So what do you do this? So we understand the challenges. How do we bring it to the value to speed up the entire R&D process, right? So if you go to the next slide, please. And this is where we are kind of laying out what we're seeing in the industry is a lot of companies have already started to tackle this, right? So if you look at some of the partnerships that Sanofi has announced, some of the information from their website, GNS itself has been leveraging patient data, the adoption of intelligent systems itself from Novo Nordisk, and even some of the case studies I talked about, even from a Pfizer perspective, right? And the stuff that they have spotlighted. It is everywhere. Everybody is trying to tackle it, but what is that right way to bring it all together to drive the R&D forward very quickly, right? And that's where we're going to show the roadmap in the next slide, right? So if you look at the next slide, please. It has all to be driven by value, right? So let's start with the end goal in mind. Where do we want to get? We want to get to a point where we have significantly reduced the total R&D timeline to the drug discovery, with the right insights, the right patients to target, the right healthcare providers to work with, all driven by data, right? And so if that's the value you want to get to, how do you get there, right? So if you look at this roadmap, it starts, as I said, right, understanding of the data sources that will help drive your R&D, for example. But that's not enough, right? It has to be intelligent data where you're bringing the data sets together, cleansed and curated to drive the insights. But how do you bring it together? That's where the platform comes in, right? A platform such as AWS or Azure, where you bring it all together to drive the right insights and visualizations that can easily be consumed, but not just by select few, but by the broader audience. And then finally, right, this is not one time done. This is an ongoing management of information. So that's where a lot of your governance information, the security information, compliance with the local environments come in, right? So you need a very, very sustainable, scalable governance structure. You need a data catalog to give you visibility of what's available to each of the people, and then enabling a culture that helps you drive self-service of the data sets itself, right? So imagine not just giving a few people access, but making it more democratized. So more and more folks, depending upon their scientific needs within the discovery group, the clinical group, the regulatory or pharmacovigilance group, can look and have visibility to the right data sets that it can quickly bring together with this platform and the different data sets to drive the insights, right? So that is what you will get. You will help you get to that value to speed up this entire end-to-end process, specifically in the clinical trial area. If you go to the next slide, and this is something that's already happening, right? So what we have done here is kind of mapped out some of the use cases, within, each of the towers of the R&D value chain, right? So if you look at research itself, within the molecule design, a lot of cases using synthetic data to help you target the right, molecule to go after, right? What is the right bio pathway? What are the right biomarkers for your patients? The right way to find the right lead optimization. So all of that can be driven literally in a simulation with a lot of external data and synthetic data that's generated from sources. Right? And we're already seeing that happening across various ways, right? The whole alpha folding, the Google platform, if you remember from a couple of years, is a big step in that direction. Within the clinical space itself, if you look, right, site selection, right, finding the right sites. This data is amazing, right? What we have discovered in working with our clients is that a lot of cases, almost 40% of the sites they actually recruit do not recruit a single patient, right? So just think about that, right? Sites that you spend money on, almost 40% of them do not recruit a single patient over the life cycle of the trial. That's a huge statistic, right? So right at the start itself, when you're setting up your protocol, you have to find the data sets to not only identify the right sites based on the historical information, the current information given the all geopolitical stuff that's happening around us, depending on the COVID situation, for example, where the patients may not be recruited. So all of that information has to be factored in to find the right sites, but also targeting the right set of patients, right? What is a patient profile that help you and those patients to stay on the trial, adhere to the regimen that you're prescribing for them, and then not drop off, right? So having that insight again upfront will save a lot of downstream costs. And then once you've kind of launched the study, actually literally using I would say a clinical control tower, right? A risk-based clinical control tower to monitor the study and make corrections real time, right? Literally like a big, a dashboard itself to make corrections as you progress through the trial. So to prevent, any issues. And in some cases, even if you find potentially that, some of these drug discoveries will not work based on your early insights, you actually start on these trials early on, right? And imagine the cost savings if you start something in phase 1 or phase 2 versus phase 3 or phase 4, right? So a lot of that stuff is also a monitoring part. Then kind of going to the patient itself, as we said, right? Finding the right patients. We talked about that, who would adhere to your medication based on not just your traditional patient clinical data, but also your socioeconomic information, your financial information, and also information that's coming from several patient groups, for example, right? What we have found is in our research that the reason the patients drop off from a trial, almost 80% is not related to clinical reasons. Could be a variety of socioeconomic reasons. We have seen where patients could not drive to a site, or patients were not in a very good financial condition to actually continue on the trial. So if you have some of those insights early on, you're able to quickly help them, team up with a taxi service or an Uber service, provide them the right financial help, and so on and so forth, right? So the idea is having an earlier that that, the better action you can take early on to keep trial going properly. And same thing goes with even your healthcare providers, right? Finding the right segments of the healthcare providers to target who will have a propensity to prescribe your drug, right? Same thing on the adverse events, right? If you can based on a variety of data sources that we talked about, if you can predict some of these adverse events early on, you can take a lot of actions, right? Instead of finding out in a social media site, or worse, finding the regulatory governing body actually sending you a warning letter, right? So there's a great potential there, and we're already seeing that happening. And finally, on the regulatory side, right? We know about the IDMP regulations which are coming on, so that's a big thing. But also, how do you customize your engagement with each of the health authorities, right? For example, pre-populating a lot of the submission documents, right? Using AI, ML, finding the right way to engage with the health authority, but having some of those insights and having that preparation as a decision support system for the group that's submitting the documentation, for example, right? That can be a huge benefit. And all of this, as you see, is underlain by the right data, the right platform, and the right way to drive insights that helps accelerate the entire process. What we'll do, I'll just give you a couple of case studies just to make it very real for you. And as I said, right, this is not a pipe dream. It's already happening in various parts of the industry. It's now driving this the story is now about driving this at scale across the entire R&D value chain within each of our pharma companies. Right? If you go to the next slide. So this is a case study, right? And I want to just kind of quickly lay out, right? This is a very large oncology pharma client, right? And we have been working with them for a while. And what we found, right, in this case, that almost 48% of the sites that they were recruiting for the clinical trials, on average, less than as I said, 40% were not even recruiting single patient, right? Which means they do almost 300, 400 trials per year. If 48% of the sites that they recruit or they select do not recruit a single patient, imagine the amount of the cost impact, right? So we drove a process, but before I go into how we got there, if you look at some of the benefits that they achieved, right? It's literally within a period of 3 years, like 30% reduction in non-performing site, 40% reduction in patient drop-off, and almost $80 million savings per year. And how is this driven, right? Literally, it's reimagining the clinical trial, right? Driven by data and predictive analysts instead of traditional way to look at the historical information and the gut feel, right? So in this case, as I talked about earlier, right? Setting up the right, the protocol definition, the right inclusion-exclusion criteria, the right endpoint optimization, the right sites to go after, patient profiles who would be conducive to the trial that you're trying to execute, right? And not just driven by clinical data, but driven by socioeconomic or financial information. All that, very rapidly, right? In a period of weeks, we were able to very quickly show which sites to go after, not to go after, which patients profiles to go after, right? And that really helped us come up with some of these numbers as you see here. And this process was tried for a certain trial. It was so successful that now it's being implemented across their entire portfolio. The second use case, quickly, if you go there, the second case is more from the regulatory perspective, right? If you go to the next slide. So the second case study talks about the whole submission tracking process, right? And again, as you see, right, it's a pretty, and you have a variety of tools like Viva, etc., that helps you with the entire process. But what about the predictive side of it? What about the insights part of it? What if you can populate a lot of the documentation, as I talked about beforehand, almost 60, 70%. So only 30% is left to human, intervention. You're able to customize your, your documentation, the way you're presenting your, the entire output to the authority and customized by authority, right? Having some of those insights early on. And again, all this driven by data, as you can imagine, right? In this entire process, there's lots of hands-on. The very first thing we did in this use case study was link it all together, literally from end to end with a workflow tool, right? So that immediately brought out the issues between different silos. Everybody was optimizing within their silo, but they were not, looking across, right? So that immediately became visible. And as that became mature, right, we literally started using the historical data to predict where the quality of issues would be and proactively address them, right? And then finally bringing AI/ML to automate a lot of the tasks in the entire process. That's what led to some of these great numbers, as you see, like 30% reduction in quality issues, 25% cost reduction, and a huge improvement in accuracy and completeness, right? And the key part also was involving the regulatory authorities from day one, right? A lot of cases we have been using real world data as part of the submission documentation. Some cases even using data to replace patients. So think about it, right? Synthetic data to replace at least a portion of the placebo arm or the treatment arm in some cases, right? So all of that, journey with the health authority involved leads to a lot of these, improvements. So again, the future is bright. We see this happening across the industry, and as some of the things lay out here, right, this will really, really lead to a great, whole, change in the process how R&D is executed. Nicole, I guess back to you.